Should John Swinney resign? Well, who cares really? Because who'd he be replaced by? He'd be replaced by someone who's just as bad. The whole philosophy of education in the SNP and in the whole Scottish Parliament is flawed. Not a single MSP can see that. They can see that it's not working, but they don't know how to fix it. With this exam grade crisis, MSPs of all parties and the media are missing several key points, and they're also missing the underlying bigger picture. Here it is.
I can confirm to Parliament today that all downgraded awards will be withdrawn. Using powers available to me in the Education Scotland Act 1996, I am today directing the SQA to reissue those awards based solely on teacher or lecturer judgment.
Well, let's start at the beginning. They shouldn't have cancelled the exams in any case. At the point where lockdown started, it was just at the start of the Easter holiday, so they had the Easter holiday, then there would only have been a month until the Scottish exams were taking place. They could have said, right, we're going to go for this, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but we can do it. There's any amount of online help that you need. The teachers have got lots of time, they can be chatting, video chats, etc. In terms of actually administering the exams, you've got whole school buildings empty, you've got whole teaching staffs available. So they could have been spread out as much as necessary. The exams could have gone ahead. But of course, that's completely against the ethos of Scottish education. The idea of, there's a challenge, we can do this. No, you don't get that at all. What you get is, pupil well-being, don't worry about your work, just try and keep yourself happy. We'll just throw in the towel. When a challenge comes along, we just all give up. That's the message that was given. And that's in accord with the usual ethos in Scottish education. But having done that, what you do, the pupils need grades. They need to go to university. They need it on their CVs. So what are you going to do instead if you've cancelled the exams? What's plan B? Well, basically, there isn't one. There isn't a good way to do it. There's no remotely fair method of allocating grades to pupils without some system of formal assessment like the exams. So what did the SQA do, the Scottish Qualifications Authority? Well, it's not their fault. They were landed in this situation. And so they decided, right, teacher estimates. That's the best we've got. Right, from the SQA website, it says this. An initial investigation was undertaken in relation to estimated grades and resulted grades based on data from the 2019 Diet of Examinations. On average, only 45% of estimated grades match the actual grades that were awarded. In other words, if you just go by teacher grades, most of them are wrong compared to what they would actually have got. So 45% of them are right, 55% of estimated grades are wrong, about 1/3 of them are out with one band of their estimates. So 33% of estimates are wrong by 2 grades or more. And we're not talking about a scale like, say, A-level, where it goes from A to E. We're just talking about an A to C pass scale. And 1/3 of them are out by 2 grades. This is not looking good, is it? So let's look at some of the data from SQA. This is looking at the accuracy of predicted grades from last year's National 5s. There's a similar picture for higher and advanced higher. So this is broken down by the classifications of deprivation, as they call it. I'm not sure how meaningful these are, but this is the only data we've got. So the darkest blue is the most deprived areas, the lightest blue, the least deprived. So the grade was underestimated in about 30% of cases. They got it right in about average, the 45% or whatever. And it was overestimated, you can see the figures there, by about 20% for the most deprived, going down much lower for the least deprived. In other words, the teachers are more likely to overestimate performance in the most deprived areas. And it's quite a linear relationship. Now that's from a previous year. Now in previous years, the motivation for teachers was to try to get these predictions right so that they appear competent. Now this year, the motivation's different. They know that these grades are actually what's going to count. These predicted grades are what's going to count. So the motivation is to inflate them, to get good results. And also, all the other schools will be at it, all the other teachers will be at it as well. So the temptation is very much to inflate the grades. And if you look at what happened, that is indeed borne out. I mean, a lot of teachers, if you hear them talking, well, there are a fair few of them at least. If you look at what they put on Twitter, it's things like, every one of my English class is so special. They all deserve an A because they're so lovely. And it seems like that sort of thinking is translating into the hard predictions that teachers are providing to the SQA. So let's have a look at some of the figures here. Again, looking at the bottom of the table, this is the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Like I say, not sure how meaningful it is, but that's what we've got. So let's look at what happened. In 2019, this is for higher, 65.3% got an A to C at higher. And then suddenly this year, the estimate was that 85.1% are going to get it. So a 20% increase this year. So the IQ of the population in these areas has suddenly vastly improved, or they've studied much, much harder. I don't know why, but in any case, 20% improvement. If you go down to the so-called least deprived, last year, actually 81.7% got A to C or higher, and then this year it's estimated suddenly it shoots up to 91%. So for the least deprived, the predictions shot up by 10%, but for the most deprived, they went up by 20% on the actual facts. Now, again, you can look at this in another way here. So this table is showing, again, going back to National 5, proportion of pupils getting A to C. Now the baseline there is the least deprived, and then this is showing how the other areas are basically performing at a lower level compared to that. So the blue line is showing how far below the most deprived areas are from the least deprived. So you can see they're a long way behind on the graph, also getting further behind. You can see the deterioration there year on year. But then look what happens at the 2020 estimates. That's the second from the right. Look what happens there. All of a sudden, they shoot up and they're getting much closer to the least deprived areas. And then on the right, you can see the actual 2020 results. Because what the SQA did, they looked at these predictions and they said, look, we can see through what's going on here. We need to moderate these because they're completely unrealistic. I mean, this is fantasy world predictions. So we need to moderate them a bit to make them a bit more realistic. So they moderated them to create the bars at the far right. Now you can see there, they're still showing vast improvement on previous years. They're obviously still extremely unrealistic, but they're not quite as completely unbelievable as the teacher estimates. So the SQA, quite rightly, tried to perform some moderation. How did they do it? Basically, they asked each school to rank their pupils, to give them predicted grades, but also to rank them. So, for example, if you've got a school where usually they only get, say, 50 grade A's in the whole year group, whereas this year they've suddenly said, they're getting 100. Well, what they do, they look at the list, they look at the bottom few who got grade A's, the ones that think who only just got grade A's, and they said, well, actually, we're going to call these bottom few a B, just to make it a bit more realistic. So this process did hit kids in poorer schools, so schools in poorer areas, which is going to tend to be less well-off kids. It did hit them disproportionately, but it was only partially compensating for the inflated estimates of their teachers. Now, one way around this issue, these estimates should have been entirely secret, and the pupils shouldn't have known what was submitted to SQA, but it seems like in a lot of cases they did know. So was this unfair to some pupils? Yes, of course it is. It's inevitable. As soon as you start treating groups instead of individuals, then it's going to be unfair. But what the SQA did was actually more fair than just going by the teacher's estimates. The ones who've been hit most unfairly are the ones who would have worked above averagely hard for the exams. Who are they? You can't tell if you don't actually do the exams. So the SQA have done their best in an impossible situation, but you need objective individual assessment. They didn't have it, so they've made the best of a bad job. And the other parties knew that this was going to happen, and broadly speaking, they were pretty happy with it. So then the results come out, and what happens? You get teenagers with placards complaining that this is all very unfair. Because the only part of the message that they understand is, we've been downgraded more because our school is in a more deprived area. Okay, they miss out the bit that the teachers in that school have obviously inflated the grades more, but they just pick on the fact that they've been brought down more to compensate. So what happens then? Well, this is Scottish politics. So let's read. However, Miss Sturgeon insisted she'd changed her mind after spending the weekend reading letters and emails from unhappy teenagers. So forget all of the detailed statistical analysis performed by the Scottish Qualifications Authority that's done the very best to make this fair by some sort of objective standard. All that goes out the window because when teenagers are waving placards. Now in the Scottish Parliament, empathy is king. If some people are not happy, if they're upset, if their sense of well-being being affected, then you obviously have to, that overrides everything else. And you can't upset young people. This government has set itself out as a government that wants people to listen to young people. By listen, they mean do what they want. This is similar to what happened with the climate change children's protests outside the Parliament. So school kids go and protest, and in response it seems that Nicola Sturgeon declared a climate emergency. So what we've got from the SNP really here is political expediency. The SQA's process was perfectly defensible under the circumstances, but the SNP capitulated under the pressure. Now, of course, they've avoided some unpopularity. They've avoided these school pupils having a go at them. But what all the other pupils need to realise is that this has devalued their grade. So if you'd already got an A under the fairer system, and now there's lots more A's, that devalues your qualification. But I would guess most school pupils won't understand that, so there won't be placards being waved around. So the government doesn't need to worry about that injustice. But going back to it, the original mistake here was cancelling the exams in the first place. Now, of course, being Scottish education, I mean, equality is a huge focus. And Nicola Sturgeon and all the other parties in the Scottish Parliament, they say their main goal in education is to close the attainment gap. They want pupils in schools in less wealthy areas to do just as well as pupils in schools in more wealthy areas. So that's what's led to this capitulation as well. But the lesson for kids here is if you want something like good grades, working hard can help, but waving placards demanding that the government gives you higher grades is what really counts, and it's a lot less work just making a quick placard. Now, the SQA's website is full of equality and diversity babble about the exam results, about how different groups do, apart from, of course, they're not interested in the fact that girls outperform boys at almost all levels, apart from the very highest and the most advanced qualifications. Now, if someone suggested they should try to do something about that, all hell would break loose. If that was reversed, if it was the girls outperforming boys consistently, they would talk about little else in the Scottish Parliament. It would be a crisis needing to be addressed. Now, the SQA also said that they've got some evidence that the estimated grades for pupils of ethnic minorities tend to be overestimated. So it would have been quite reasonable, on the basis they're operating on, to actually lower the grades, to moderate slightly for pupils from ethnic minorities. Now, I'm not suggesting they should have done that, but it would have been logical on their own logic to have done so. Imagine what a fuss that would have caused. But it just shows how things just descend into nonsense as soon as you start trying to treat groups instead of individuals. So anyway, the upshot of this is hugely inflated grades for pupils in lower performing schools, which tend to be in less wealthy areas. So it's rewarded kids with unrealistic teachers and schools that basically decided to chance it and put in ridiculously unrealistic predicted grades. It's penalised pupils who are in schools where the teachers and the school leadership were more responsible and professional and gave more realistic predicted grades. Now, hang on a minute here. Let's not forget that this objective of closing the poverty-related attainment gap, well, this year, it's sort of been achieved. It's narrowed massively. Now, the SNP was already in the process of making the exam system in Scotland IQ-proof. I mean, they've got their national 4 exams that pupils take when they're 15 or so, and basically everyone passes. You just pass or fail, and you can retake as long as you like, as many times as you like, and it's all based on teacher assessment. So that's one way of closing the attainment gap, isn't it? I mean, if the teacher assesses it, keep doing it, everyone gets the same grade. Of course you're going to close the attainment gap. Now, let's look at what's happened with this. Now, if you just use teachers' predictions instead of actual hard individual assessment evidence, this closes the attainment gap. So does this show the way forward, people are thinking? Surely we should forget these pesky exams that actually show what kids can do, and let's just give grades according to what the nice teacher thinks, and then all groups can get the same average grades. Surely people are not thinking that. Well, that's exactly what people are thinking. The highly influential Commonweal website is a sort of think tank group. They're very, very influential. A couple of articles on their website making this very point. Here's one. If anything, the results this year, based on teacher estimations, show that in terms of coursework, working class kids perform just as well as those from more affluent communities. However, when it comes to exams, they tend to be far worse. Instead of accepting that actually teachers and coursework, not outdated memory tests, are better suited at judging a young person's overall academic abilities, the government has potentially ruined the academic chances of a generation. Well, that's hysterical nonsense. I mean, for a start, these predicted grades were not based on coursework. These were the teacher's prediction of how these pupils would perform in the exam. So their predictions were bad. It's not that they measured one thing and it didn't match with another. They were predicting exam results and they weren't very good at it. And this is the thing, the suggestion that the exams are not memory tests. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. I mean, for a start, the Scottish qualification system is very much skewed towards what they call skills rather than actually learning facts, which I don't think is a particularly good thing. But the exams are memory tests. Advanced higher maths is just a memory test. Get serious. I mean, that's just complete rubbish. Right, here's another one from the Commonweal website. We should use this crisis as a moment not to cover up failures, but to throw open the doors to new possibilities. It was bureaucratic, centralised, exam results-obsessed management systems that got us into this mess. If Swinney wants to get us out, he'll have to think differently. So they're saying we've got into this mess because of the exam system. So this mess that's been caused by not having exams is actually the fault of the exam system. So this person is complaining about a bureaucratic, centralised, exam results-obsessed system. So what they mean by that is a system that applies the same standard for all pupils, is objectively tested in a way that eliminates teacher bias. And they say that's what needs to go in order to get the outcomes that we want. Now, if there's some sort of extreme nonsense going on, obviously the Scottish Green Party will be at the forefront of it. This is what they say. The Scottish Greens have long made the case that high-stakes exams at the end of a school year are a poor way of judging a young person's attainment, and may be a particularly bad way of judging pupils from the most disadvantaged communities. We look forward to the results of the OECD review and the opportunity to replace Scotland's outdated assessment system with one fit for the 21st century. Now, don't forget the rule in the Scottish Parliament. What the Greens are saying 1 year, the SNP, Lib Dems and Labour are saying a year or two later, and the Conservatives run along 3 or 4 years later saying exactly the same thing. So that's the direction we've begun to head in. Now, John Swinney himself has made vague comments about reviewing how exams and teacher assessment are going to be used in the future. So then the SNP will be open to heading in this direction. They're already heading in this direction, but I think we're going to see a big step in it as well, in the new normal that's going to come in the next few years. I mean, this idea that exams disadvantage the poor, and it's not really borne out by the facts. I mean, looking in England, where there's far better data on these things, the correlation between GCSE results at age 16 and IQ measured 5 years earlier is about 0.87, which is a very high degree of correlation. It's about the amount of correlation you'd expect if you sat an IQ test one day, sat another IQ test the next day. Compared to the two results, they'd be about that similar. So there's very, very strong evidence that academic ability is the overriding, dominating factor in exam results. But of course, those on the progressive liberal left of politics can't accept that. They've got the blank slate belief. They believe that all sorts of abilities are distributed equally between every group. They don't believe that because of the evidence. They believe it because that's just a matter of principle for them. And then their social justice philosophy demands that outcomes must reflect their theoretical belief of equity. Now, when that doesn't happen by equality of opportunity, in other words, you let everyone sit the same exams and see how they come out, if that doesn't work, then you need to start rigging the system. And that's what they want to start doing here. They've already done it with this year's exams. They're going to do it more and more in the future. So we'll end up, roughly speaking, that there will be a quota of A grades for pupils in the wealthiest areas, the next ones, and a quota for the pupils in the least well-off areas, and that will, as far as they're concerned, that will solve the problem of the attainment gap. It will make the system completely unfair, but it will solve the problem. They'll get the results that they want. Then, of course, I mean, things are really getting started with race, aren't they? We'll then have, a quota of grades for different races. Will they start adjusting for different races? Then whatever next, LGBT, who knows? Will they start adjusting for sex, making boys and girls results the same? No, of course not, because the difference is, as far as the progressive left is concerned, it's in the right direction. The girls outperform the boys overall, so there's no problem there. I mean, just basically, teacher assessment is unreliable. I mean, it's just a little snippet. Just watch this.
It shows, in the red bars, the proportion of primary 7 pupils who were actually attaining the appropriate level in the various objective tests. That's the level D in 5 to 14 and primary 7. In the black bars are what teachers thought they were achieving. The discrepancy is quite large.
In any medical research, if it's going to have any credibility, it's got to be double blind. And what they mean by that is that the doctor assessing the patient who's been given the treatment or the placebo doesn't know which one it is. Because if the doctor knows that they're assessing someone who's been given the treatment, it tends to colour their assessment of the patient. Whereas teachers are assessing the kids that they've been teaching themselves for, a year or two. It's a hopelessly biased situation. If you leave things down to subjective teacher assessment, then objectivity goes out of the window. We say we want a meritocratic system with objective assessment that doesn't involve teacher assessment as the main element. Okay, so there can be a small element of coursework, but the vast majority of the assessment must be based on an objective system, like exams. Okay, what are pupils with particular needs, pupils who are disadvantaged in some ways? Okay, you try and offer them extra help. You make the schools in those areas as good as you possibly can to help them to meet the standard. You don't bring the standard down to meet them, you bring them up to meet the standard. In Scottish education, in the Scottish political establishment as well, there's a real anti-academic, anti-meritocratic philosophy that's taken hold. And we're going to head further in that direction. That's going to further erode the quality of Scottish education. The Conservatives, can they see that? Labour? No, they're not picking up on that because they're too busy with their opportunistic attacks on John Swinney and the SNP. So should Swinney resign? Who cares? It would make no difference. The whole educational philosophy of the SNP is wrong. The other parties in the Scottish Parliament can't see that. It's not going to be solved by taking people out. This problem is going to be solved by putting people into the Parliament. Put Scottish Family Party MSPs in there to inject some new thinking and a genuine challenge to the failed approach to education that dominates in the Scottish Parliament, and we might see some positive change. If you want to see that happen, you can support us by joining the Scottish Family Party right now. There's a link below. Thanks for watching.